the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, November 18th, 2014. In anticipation of President Obama's executive action on immigration, we'll speak with Carlos Amador of the California Immigrant Policy Center about what we can expect and how Republicans are responding. And Chip Jacobs joins us to discuss his new book, The People's Republic of Chemicals. We'll examine the price that Chinese citizens and the world are paying for that nation's manufacturing boom and just how significant the recent U.S.-China climate deal is. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Two armed Palestinian men entered a synagogue in Jerusalem this morning, attacking worshippers, killing 4 and injuring 6. The men were shot dead by Israeli police. The incident, which was immediately dubbed a terror attack, is likely to exacerbate tensions around the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem, where the two men were from. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it, quote, a cruel murder of Jews who came to pray and were killed by despicable murderers. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas also condemned the attack and added that Israel needs to end its, quote, provocations all over the mosque. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called the incident, quote, an act of pure terror and senseless brutality and violence. Now, Bob, it's easy to condemn this massacre by the two men as a terrorist act, but how do you put it into context?
Well, the easy way to put it into context is with one word, of course, and that's occupation. Every time people ask for context, that's all we need to say. Occupation, occupation. We're now going 65 years plus of occupation. But of course, occupation is just one word, so let's use some more. The so-called separation barrier, land seizures, the constant maximal expansion of Israel into the usable territory, limited water rights, and oh, by the way, a regular bombing campaign and incursion into Gaza. So, I mean, calling people who act for political reasons despicable murderers doesn't help us understand the political roots of the conflict. This isn't about murder. We do all decry the loss of innocent life, but it's a question of occupation. And until in the U.S. the news media can frame it that way, I think we're never going to truly understand.
And then in the wake of the beheading of American Peter Kasich in Syria by the Islamic State militant group, President Obama has apparently ordered a review of the policy of dealing with hostage takers. ABC News obtained a letter from a high-ranking Pentagon official indicating a review will be taking place. Kasich became the 5th American to be executed by ISIS. European hostages have a much greater likelihood of surviving a kidnapping, primarily because their governments often cough up the demanded ransom. It's not clear if the U.S. will consider offering ransoms, countering that the rate of kidnappings would also rise. Now, Bob, it's a grim calculation to make when it's your own child or spouse. National policy be damned. You just want your government to pay the money to bring your loved ones home. How do you assess current U.S. policy of standing firm against ISIS demands?
Well, this is one where I think there's kind of a lose-lose option. Obviously, one wants to secure the safety of innocents. On the other hand, I think it's a reasonable claim that when you pay ransom, you increase the likelihood that people will be kidnapped for ransom. We're kind of in false alternatives. I think better is to step back and say, what kind of U.S. foreign policy would reduce the source of the support for the people taking hostages? That's what we really need to think about, is how do we craft a foreign policy that doesn't put people at risk for being taken hostage in the first place? That may seem like kind of a big picture point, but because it drops out in these short-term discussions so much, I think we constantly need to put that back on the table.
And I appreciate that context very much. Finally, as the nation waits with bated breath for a grand jury decision in St. Louis, Missouri, Governor Jay Nixon has announced a state of emergency. Specifically, the governor has activated the National Guard for the next 30 days to, quote, support law enforcement during any period of unrest. If the grand jury decides not to indict Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson with charges related to the fatal shooting of 18-year-old Michael Brown, public rage is likely to boil over. Organizers on the ground in Ferguson have been preparing for days, organizing and planning their responses. But St. Louis law enforcement has also prepared itself with $100,000 worth of equipment and training in crowd control. The decision is expected to be announced any day now. Now, Bob, I don't know if Jay Nixon knows something we don't know about where the grand jury is heading, but many fear that his declaration of a state of emergency means that Wilson will be let off the hook. How do you view these preparations?
Well, I'm appalled that this announcement would be made. to say we won't tolerate violence is essentially to say we think you people are violent, and of course we know who those people are, African Americans. It's almost a provocation. Certainly law enforcement should take precautions because there is a possibility of violence and people getting hurt. But what would it have been like if public officials in Missouri had, instead of ramping up the police presence, decided they were going to have a town hall meeting, to have a standing call for a town hall meeting sponsored by the state of Missouri and the city of St. Louis and the city of Ferguson, inviting people in. It doesn't mean that there won't be conflict, but it means that the people in charge are signaling they actually care about the citizens. That would have been, I think, a really revolutionary act.
And also one wonders what would happen if they put all of these resources into actually addressing why people are angry, which is police brutality, instead of fomenting what is likely to be police brutality.
I don't think it's out of line to call this a racist act on the part of the governor.
Well, Bob Jensen, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you next week again.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. And by the way, we have special coverage planned for the grand jury decision when it is announced, so definitely stay tuned to Uprising for that. We'll be right back after this break. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. President Obama is expected to announce his executive policy on reducing deportations of undocumented immigrants in a widely anticipated move. Mr. Obama had promised an announcement over the summer, but then changed his mind, waiting until after the midterm elections. Many interpreted this move as a cynical ploy to appease a conservative electorate, which ended up voting for Republicans anyway. Now, according to leaked reports of what the president intends, his executive action is expected to build on a policy directive announced 2 years ago, which offered delayed deportation for some undocumented immigrants who came to the U.S. as minors. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants took advantage of that delay to remain in the U.S. The new action is likely to offer relief for their parents. My guest is Carlos Amador. He is the lead organizer at the California Immigrant Policy Center. Welcome to Uprising, Carlos.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, we've talked about this in earlier discussions of the midterm elections, but I'd love your opinion. What do you make of this calculation that Obama made to postpone his executive action until after the elections? Aside from impacting people's lives, did it even work politically for him to do that?
Well, I think looking at the responses from the polls on the night of the election, it obviously didn't go well. Go well for the Democratic Party, but especially for his calculations. I mean, he's been delaying administrative action for years now. Back in 2012, that's when he took administrative action on behalf of the youth, and he could have done that back then for the adults as well, for the rest of the immigrant community. So obviously his calculation has failed, and now he feels in some way isolated or by himself.
Right. Now, in fact, on that last decision that he took in 2012, it sort of worked, right? I mean, at least politically. If we're going simply by political calculations and not by how it affected people's lives, he announced a policy, he got reelected.
Yeah, definitely. He got reelected, and I think something that was very telling was that as soon as the announcement came out in 2012, Mitt Romney, who was his, who was running against
his rival,
him, he didn't take a opposing position to the country. He said that he would, look at the program, and he would consider keeping it if he was to be elected. So he didn't take a completely opposing position, which is something that is a little different from where Republicans are speaking at right now.
Right.
But yeah, it totally worked for him. And I think, now he should be continue going bold, big and bold on taking his actions.
So let's talk about what we know about the policy itself. The New York Times has revealed that two different versions are being considered, and there have been sort of various leaks of drafts and reviews and considerations to the press, maybe purposely to see how people react. But there's one plan that would allow up to 3.3 million undocumented immigrants who've lived without papers in the U.S. for at least 5 years to remain, to get work authorizations and avoid deportation. There's another version, similar, but that would only make that available for people who've been in the U.S. for at least 10 years. That would impact far fewer people, 2.5 million. What are your thoughts on these two versions of a plan?
I think he continues to try to play it safe. It at least sounds like from the leaked documents. He needs to be taking a much more progressive and bold stance on his affirmative choices. So I think when we say like only 3.3 million people will benefit, only 4 million people will benefit, like it leaves 6 million people outside. And continues to put them in the shadows. And I think something important to realize is that once this administrative relief happens, there seems to be an increase on criminalizing those that are left out.
Right.
So I think it's important to consider that all of our communities are living here, are contributing here, are planning to stay here. That we need to consider everyone to be able to be part of this program.
So I understand there's also apparently a plan to ease restrictions on undocumented farm workers. We don't think much about farm workers, but these are the people who pick the food that we eat and often paid so little. Many live in horrible conditions and are vulnerable populations who worry about being deported and separated from their families. What would this involve, and how important do you think it is for us to address undocumented farm workers?
Yeah, it's extremely important, especially coming from the state of California, where we have the majority of undocumented or undocumented farm workers. I think it would be, I think when we talk about like policy and creating categories, right, like the parents of U.S. citizen children or legal permanent residents or folks that came here at a young age, instead of taking those approaches, he should like do a large and broad spectrum of like people that would benefit from it.
So you're saying that it's better for him to cast a wider net rather than seeking out certain demographics, certain populations within the undocumented community?
Exactly, and I think obviously there's folks in the high-tech industry that are looking for some administrative fixes. There's young folks that were, or young adults that were left out of the Deferred Action Program in 2012
because they graduated too early or something like that.
Because they were over the age of 31 by June 2012. So there's a lot of folks that are being left out, and I think instead of thinking of like which categories are should be considered, which essentially implies a exclusive way of thinking about it.
Right. If you're just lucky enough to be part of some club, you might get it, and otherwise you might be left out.
But we should definitely keep in mind, right, like the undocumented farm workers and the families that are picking up the food for us.
Right. There's also some indication that Obama might revamp a program, a very controversial program called Secure Communities. This is a program that states participated that enable law enforcement to hand over immigrants who don't have papers that they might have arrested, whether or not those arrests have anything to do with a crime, and turn them over to the Homeland Security, and then eventually they're deported. Now, in California, where this program is produced, we passed the Trust Act, and now I understand it's sort of an optional program, but in most of the rest of the country, it isn't. What do you think President Obama might do on that front?
So, here in California and in some other states, they passed Trust Act or Trust Act-like bills, and it has decreased the number of people that are turned into ICE. But at the same time, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But at the same time, we know that counties and local law enforcement have violated the Trust Act even here in California. Folks that get turned over to ICE, and we oftentimes we never hear about them. So I think it's important to try to do to actually completely get rid of the Secure Communities program. I think that's something that many advocates and organizers are asking and demanding from Obama. because this ICE law enforcement collaboration continues to decrease the trust that exists on law enforcement from the communities, but also puts in jeopardy a lot of the families and the separation of the families.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that a little later in the program. Now, whenever we have Democrats making deals on immigration, trying to make political calculations, often the price that is paid for people who are already here to get some relief is that the border becomes more militarized. I mean, you saw this in the first term of President Obama, thinking that he would get some give from Republicans by pouring resources to militarize the U.S.-Mexico border even more than it already is. So I'm wondering if you think that that's a price that Obama is going to make people pay overall, that some of those who are here might get some relief, but the danger and the actually very, very severe violence that we see at the border might get even worse.
Yes, and I think that is definitely a trend that we continue to see, and that both Republicans and Democrats tend to support, right? Like, let's continue to close the border, let's continue to not allow anyone else in. But the reality is that the borders are, pretty much closed for the most part. And I think it's also important to understand that the impact that it has to militarize the border, to increase the number of border agents, border patrol agents, has a tremendous impact on the people that live alongside the border, right? So oftentimes we forget that there's a lot of communities, vibrant communities that live alongside the border, and they're oftentimes profiled, victims of violence, victims of harassment, whether they're immigrants or not, right? Like, and I think it's important to continue reminding not only President Obama but the rest of the immigrant rights community, especially those that live and work in Washington, that the border town communities need to be part of this. The negotiations need to be part of the discussions and shouldn't be left behind.
I think you're alluding to the fact that many mainstream immigrant rights groups have been kind of part of this risk-benefit conversation with the Democrats. I mean, we see a similar thing happening in organized labor, that this calculation is being made. If we take the side of the Democrats, we might get a crumb or two from their table, and some groups are willing to sell away the safety of these border communities, among other things.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the opposition from the GOP, which is, of course, expectedly, predictably very vocal and very angry. House Speaker John Boehner has already promised to, quote, fight the president tooth and nail. They're threatening to shut down the government if President Obama, or when he makes his announcement. And one of the ways they're going to do this, apparently, is to attempt to restrict funding for some of the policies. Can they do that?
Well, I mean, how the House can pass whatever they want, and they have, right? Like, they have voted to repeal Obamacare. They have voted to, get rid of many of the protections that the, communities have. So they can definitely try to put restrictions on the president and how he uses his administrative power. I think at the end of the day, the president's the one that needs to sign the laws. And that is, I think, one of the issues right now, is that they could shut down the government by not passing any appropriations bills that are coming up in the next few months. But I think, is that the calculation they want to use? They want to be put in the position, or do they want to put themselves in the position of shutting the whole government just because we want to give relief to communities? And I think that is the story that we need to lead with, right? Like, we need to lift the voices of our community members that are being impacted by deportations and that will be impacted by this potential administrative relief, to be able to tell the rest of the American public what are the great benefits that come out of this administrative decision.
Right. What about the what Iowa Representative Steve King said? He said the audacity of this president to think he can completely destroy the rule of law with the stroke of a pen is unfathomable to me. Would President Obama be breaking the law by taking action?
Well, no, he wouldn't. In May of 2012, when we were pushing President Obama and the White House to take action to provide this protection for the youth, we had a letter drafted and signed by 98 different immigration law professors across the country, saying how laying the historical landscape of when many presidents have taken action, administrative relief action in many different ways. So Obama wouldn't be breaking the law. Actually, before deferred action, he granted relief to Haitian victims of the earthquake as well. So we know that this has happened not only in past presidencies, both Republican and Democrats, but also under his own watch, right? So he wouldn't be breaking the law. He has a vast discretion to use the resources that are provided by the Congress to act.
And in fact, he had used that vast discretion to deport unprecedented numbers of immigrants without necessarily passing those actions through Congress. And what about and so you referred earlier to just now to Republican presidents. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush also took executive action on immigration, essentially extending their 1986 amnesty law to parents and to spouses, etc. Has the GOP forgotten that?
I mean, I think that the GOP has been, appealing to the far right, to the extreme conservatives that obviously are ruling the party at this time, and they're afraid that they will be, that the few, I guess, moderate Republicans will be, pushed out of their seats as well. But I think we need to remember that, the trends, that we see happening across the country, though these past elections might not be a good, litmus test for that. We know that the trends moving towards immigrant-friendly policies and the support and the inclusion of immigrants in the communities.
Right. So, Carlos, a lot of commentators are saying that President Obama is betraying a sentiment that he himself expressed when George W. Bush was in power. That executive action by the president is, quote, not how a democracy functions, is apparently what Obama said. And we know GW took a lot of actions on his own singularly. Some conservative commentators like David Brooks are jumping on what Obama had said in the past, saying that what he's doing now on immigration is extremely confrontational. He invoked a Ted Cruz presidency in 2007 that the president opens the door to a President Cruz doing what he likes. That if he does this executive action now, it opens the door for future presidents, extreme presidents like G.W. Bush doing something that might not be as popular for progressives.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, like he has a lot of discretion to act on, what Congress and what the Constitution says, right? So, one thing is providing relief to millions of people that already live and work and contribute to the to society here. Another thing is waging war, right?
Right. So it's a different action.
Exactly, and I think the Constitution and the laws are much clearer when it comes to to waging war in other countries and to acting on domestic issues like immigration.
So President Obama does have support among some people in his own party. There was a letter signed by a number of Senate Democrats very recently, including Harry Reid, who said that despite Republican opposition, Obama does indeed have the right to take executive action. And I'm wondering, how important is that public support for Obama's actions from within his own party?
I think it's extremely important. Unfortunately, it has been the Democratic Party that has been taking hostage these types of actions. It has been Senate Democrats and House Democrats that have asked Obama to delay the actions, oftentimes backed by a lot of the mainstream immigrant rights organizations, allowing for this to happen. So, but it's good to see that they're, I guess, coming around, and it is it's going to be really important for all of the Democrats in Congress to stand behind the president, and as much as we need to have these bold actions be taken, and when those actions happen, which we hope are large and bold, the president, we all need to stand, and support those actions. Obviously, we need to also be critical of whatever criminalization expansion happens, not only at the border but also within the country, with any of the what he says, the revamping of secure communities, hoping that it's not just changing the name, putting another title, and putting it under another different model and continuing with the criminalization of the communities.
Let's talk about at the heart, the fact that at the heart of this issue are real people, real families, our own neighbors and friends and loved ones. Recently, Diane Guerrero, an actress who stars in the hit show Orange is the New Black, wrote an op-ed for the LA Times, and she said when she was 14 years old, her parents were deported. She is a U.S. citizen. Her parents were undocumented. She came home from school one day to find her house empty, her parents taken away, and nobody in the government ensuring that she would be taken care of. She said, no one checked to see if I had a place to live or food to eat, and at 14, I found myself basically on my own. How typical is her story?
Unfortunately, it's extremely common. We hear it on that children are left behind with their aunts and uncles. Children are oftentimes put in the foster care system because there's no one else that can care for them, or even stories where these U.S. citizen children have to go back to or not go back but go with their parents and live a life in another country that they don't even know. So I think it is extremely common, and not only for U.S. citizen children but also for just children in general, right, and or families in general. I mean, my brother was deported in 2003. Many of our colleagues and activist organizers are in the same situation where we fall victims of this deportation machine, and it's so great to see what we consider a mainstream actress coming out and speaking out about her story, because those are the stories that oftentimes it's hard for us to get into that platform.
Right. So let's talk about the fact that what we constantly hear from President Obama is that it's only immigrants who have been convicted of serious crimes that are the ones being deported. And time and again, people have analyzed the data and found that that's just not true. He's probably going to make the same promises again. How do we respond to that?
I think we need to continue being vigilant, and we need to,
I mean, of course there's going to be people who commit crimes in any population of people large enough, but those crimes obviously shouldn't taint the whole population.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, people make mistakes, and, people need to, I think we need to make up for those mistakes, but that doesn't mean that we need to separate families, right?
And there's a difference between check fraud and armed robbery. One is a serious crime, the other one is a small crime.
Yeah, and people that get caught with using a fake ID because they need to work or they need to get groceries, etc. So
it's a crime related to their undocumented status in the first place.
Exactly. Many times people that get caught is because they can't prove their identity because they don't have a driver's license, or because they had a fake ID in their pockets. Right, different stories like that.
And let's talk about the fact that a lot of what might be happening soon with the president's executive action is the result of what people have been doing for years now in their relentless activism. The Dreamers and many others dubbing President Obama the deporter-in-chief, in many ways sort of boldly and unabashedly being in his face, despite what some of the mainstream immigrant rights groups might want to see. In effect, have activists forced his hand? Because we've heard the sentiment from Presidents Obama and others in the past saying, make me do it. Have people, in effect, made him do this?
I think to a great degree, yes. I mean, unfortunately, it's taking all this time for him to actually, really consider taking action. But it has been, years of push, since, obviously pre-DREAM Act legislations, but when the undocumented youth came out of the shadows, really were able to be in a position where they pressured President Obama on taking administrative relief for this specific group. But I think that has served as a stepping stone for, taking a larger action. I think we hear it on the messaging, right? Like DACA for all, right? Or DACA plus, right? We're using the messaging of the the youth as a stepping stone, as the first step to get us to a broader action, right? And I think we also need to lift the voices of many of the other communities that are left out. You brought up the communities that live around the border, right? Like the undocumented farm workers, but also, the LGBT immigrants that are, not included in any of the leaked documents that are being put out at this time, right? Like they don't have, oftentimes are not married or can't marry because of depending on the state that they live in. Oftentimes they're not considered, their marriages or their domestic partners are not considered under the rule of law. And also, like when we talk about like U.S. citizen children, then not being able to adopt, or adoption processes being really long and expensive. So I think those are things that we need to consider. Like we can't just say that, yes, let's get administrative relief for the parents, let's get administrative relief for the older, the younger adults, right? So we need to also consider those that are not able to have a family or don't want to have a family, right? Like for their own choice.
Right. So instead of piecemeal relief, whole relief, there's an interesting op-ed in the New York Times by conservative columnist Ross Douthat, who wrote this article entitled "The Great Immigration Betrayal," of course, by Obama, is how he sees. He says the status quo is untenable. Congress has the authority to act. What am I missing here? He's saying Congress has acted by, refusing to pass the DREAM Act, etc. And then he actually said, so there is no public will at work here. There's only the will to power of this White House. Is he not seeing the public will? Because is it just that immigrant rights activists who are putting their lives on the line are not seen as part of the public? Which public is he talking about here? And I'm wondering what you make of this idea that immigration reform or relief for immigrants is something that's not popular. Is it popular or is it not popular?
Administrative relief, any type of relief for immigrant communities that are struggling, that are working, that are fighting here in this country, is a popular act, right? And I think if we ask, when people have asked time and time again, people support the actions on providing opportunities and relief for this community. So I think people, especially now post-election, post-midterm elections, are caught up on this illusion that because people voted for Republicans, or the small electorate that voted for Republicans, that means that people are opposed to Obamacare and opposed to immigration reform, or opposed to any type of relief for immigrants. But when the reality is that those voices are silenced, those voices are pushed to the side, and are not considered to be part of the larger American narrative.
Well, Carlos, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Give out a website for your organization, the California Immigrant Policy Center.
Yes, you all can visit us at www.caimmigrant.org. And there's tremendous efforts happening in the next few weeks to continue putting the pressure on Obama. I think we need to, keep the voice high, and we need to make sure that he doesn't fall short.
That's caimmigrant.org, and we'll post it to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Carlos, best of luck to you. Thanks so much. My guest, Carlos Amador, is the lead organizer at the California Immigrant Policy Center. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at China. We'll speak with the co-author of a new book called The People's Republic of Chemicals. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV as well as on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Do subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year. If last week's historic climate deal between the US and China is indeed honored, it could someday, when the history of the fight against climate change is written, be seen as that crucial turning point in politics. President Barack Obama, fresh from the Democratic Party's stinging loss in the midterm elections, unveiled a major plan to curb U.S. 2005 level greenhouse gas emissions 26 to 28% by the year 2025. And for the first time, China agreed to peak its greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030, aiming to peak even earlier. The world's top two polluting economies, China and the U.S., account for a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. China's phenomenal economic ascent is intimately linked to a climate price tag that we all pay. Still, per capita, Chinese emissions are far lower than the U.S. Inside China, the impact of an explosion in export manufacturing, coal production, and car sales has meant an accompanying rise in local pollution, cancer, and other diseases. My guest is Chip Jacobs. He is the co-author with William J. Kelly of the book, The People's Republic of Chemicals. The earlier book was called Smog Town, The Lung-Burning History of Pollution in Los Angeles. I'm very pleased to welcome Chip to the studio today. Welcome to Uprising.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first let's talk about the fact that this particular climate deal is seen as quite historic. Is it too little, too late, or were you surprised that China would agree to any curbs at all?
I'm not surprised China would agree to some curbs. What I am surprised about are people heralding it as a done deal, like it's a signed treaty, and it's really not. It's more like an outline to agree to meet in Paris early next year and try to write out some specifics. I'm pretty skeptical, at least on the Chinese side, that we will get hard and fast and enforceable rules. Because when you do that, you are starting to require them to limit the size of their economy and their sort of ultimate fuel narcotic, coal.
And I want to talk about coal in just a few minutes, but where do you think this is coming from in terms of China? Does the Chinese leadership think this might be the right time because of overwhelming evidence of human causes of climate change? Is there sort of a momentum shift?
I think it's more of a political calculus going on. China has done a phenomenal job bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Now they're living a more middle-class lifestyle and actually aspiring to live more American. Air pollution, smog, environmental filth everywhere they go, from their water to tillable soil, to what happens when they walk out of an apartment on a cold day and the coal has been hovering. I think they realized they were asking for a lot of uprising and a lot more tumult in their cities. And so their plan is to try to clean up the air, placate the masses, and also assert world leadership on the environmental stage, where they have been really lacking, because in the last 20 years, it has been about GDP, the double-digit GDP. So I think it made a lot of political expedience and sure, some hopeful sound bites by them asserting this.
Right.
What people aren't talking about is, the United States agreement to reduce carbon emissions 28%. We were sort of on that trajectory to get there. So in a way, it was making promises that were a little hollow, and only time will tell whether people require the countries to do what they say.
Right. Among the reactions and responses to this climate deal, however, was countries like Brazil saying, oh, well, then maybe we can be a bit bolder too. Australia, which has really taken a 180-degree turn away from addressing climate change under Prime Minister Tony Abbott, was taken aback, and they were like, whoa, this is, what do we do now in this context? And so it has seemed to have had a tectonic shift, symbolically at least.
We will see. As it's funny about Australia, which we think was very Western and progressive and all that. When China was looking to go import coal, where do you think they went? They went to Australia, and they signed a multi-billion-dollar deal. what I think surprised me, and I am not a sinologist. A long time ago, I wanted to be a Sovietologist. What surprised me was the effect of the World Trade Organization deal, where China came into it in November 2001, and China's sort of a solicitation was under Clinton and Gore, but it was signed by Bush November 2001. We were very distracted after 9/11, and the effect on that on climate change. The idea of free trade not being free, it was sort of a rallying cry of the left, but it's proven true in the labs, in hospital rooms, in climatology groups. That is what lit the fuse on climate change that we're now worried about going over the edge about. And that's sort of where we led the book, and where we just followed where the carbon and the money came together.
Right. So let's talk about China's coal industry,
Sure.
which the leadership is hoping can peak by 2030 before it starts waning.
Yes.
But this is essentially what's used to power the factories that
Right.
make the cheap goods that we all buy. How serious is this industry? How much difference does this one industry in this one country alone make on a global front?
Coal is like an uncontrollable best friend. In one way, he's helping you get through the day, and the other way, he's just absolutely trashing your apartment while you're away at work. This is their historic fuel. They were harnessing it and creating a civilization thousands of years before Christ, partly using coal. So, this is their natural way. When the West was going through its own energy revolutions in the 60s and 70s, and places like Britain and Japan were moving away from this because of pollution and smog. And
It's the dirtiest fuel.
it's the dirtiest fuel. China was still using it, and the West had given China a lot of reasons to be xenophobic. So when China began its capitalistic/mercantilist drive into a modern economy, it stayed with coal. We helped subsidize coal technology, even though back in the late 90s, we knew that it was dangerous. So they are trying to placate the people in the eastern part of the country, reduce coal use there. And they are the world's leader in green technology, and you have to applaud them for that. They're moving faster than us, but they're still prioritizing GDP over environmental/human health. And there are some predictions that they're building these massive coal bases in the northwest provinces that are hard for us to get our heads around. Just by them, they could add 13% more coal emissions by like 2050. So when the president of China said coal is going to peak at 2030, maybe it was kind of a squishy number, but I think there's a calculation of how much they can push coal before the world will not allow it, and they'll have enough to power their own way. They have to produce enough green electricity, and under this goal, equaling all the coal production they currently have, or
Wow.
equal to all the electricity generation in the United States. That is a very big switchover, and there's going to be hue and cry from the masses when they say, you can't plug in all the time. So they build up expectations that people are building their lives around.
And this coal has powered China's economic rise on the global front. China is where it is today, financially, economically, because of its industries and its industrialization. But one of the green technologies,
Yeah.
so-called green technologies, that's
Yeah.
part of this U.S.-China climate deal is a major new pilot project to study this very controversial project of carbon capture and sequestration.
Yes.
And this is part of this idea that we can sort of technologically fix our way out of climate change. What do you make of this idea?
I'm not terribly hopeful about that type of solution. In Los Angeles, in the 60s and 70s, I think there's this perception that Los Angeles agitated its way out of its own smog dragon. That's not really the case. We had to live for a lot of years while the automakers delayed and filibustered and eventually agreed to put on catalytic converters and other exhaust control systems. But technology sometimes is your friend and sometimes takes a long time to be developed. So I am not sure that a pie-in-the-sky idea is a better way to go
Right.
than maybe asking people to rethink how they live and maybe looking at different urban designs.
Well, there's an approach that involves creating fewer emissions in the first place.
Yes.
And another that says, let's just try to sweep our emissions under the rug and keep producing. And And so what Los Angeles did, and I want to turn to that because your earlier book, Smog Town, was about the lessons
Yes.
that came out of LA's horrible, horrible smog problem that has
Yes.
eased significantly. And so China actually seemed to be a good second book for you and your co-author to work on. Wasn't LA's approach to reduce the emissions overall
Yes.
rather than sweep them under the rugs? And then, so what are the lessons for China?
This is where it gets so dicey, because I don't think Los Angeles's anti-pollution establishment, and we had to create the science, and we had to dissect the chemistry. We were, we were the petri dish
Right.
of this all.
And our children's lungs were the...
People called it the world's biggest cancer experiment, where where there would be stagnation and infighting and corporate blame mongering. People would be able to give the establishment a kick in the butt by having a protest, by organizing a petition, by voting in or out certain politicians, by writing letters to the car companies. In the 60s, suburban moms were having, some suburban moms had signs in their station wagon said, "My GM is a killing machine." In China, getting the grassroots and getting people involved and making them have a stake in it instead of having them read something on the internet saying you can't drive today. There is no really vent mechanism, avenue of grievance there. And I worry that it's going to create a bottleneck and from there a cauldron, and people are going to explode. We found that in our book, People's Republic of Chemicals. In the countryside where they brought a lot of industry, people did revolt. And they took enormous chances, like in Hong Kong, but we don't see it. And they'd be out there 10,000 against 5,000 riot cops and batons and tear gas and death and hearses and just a chaos like you can't believe. Because they did not have a constitutional right to express themselves. And so, I don't know if China is going to be able to produce a top-down environmental revolution absent people's ability to engage.
Right.
In Los Angeles, we could engage. Sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it was discordant. Some of the early smog chiefs in Los Angeles, they had like old women chasing them from suburbs saying resign and hectoring them. And one guy, one of the smog chiefs said, and I wake up in the middle of the night worried what the smog forecast is going to be.
Good.
Our smog, one of the men that replaced him actually went into a smog chamber for 2 hours to show his empathy with the people. Can you imagine somebody in China doing that? Actually, there has been a great amount of resentment built up among the Chinese masses when they learned that the Politburo, the Standing Committee, the elite of China's leadership, they all have very high-end air purifiers in their offices. And it does create a, respiratory inequality gap.
There you
And that grates on people.
So let's talk about the effect on Chinese people directly.
Right.
Your book is called The People's Republic of Chemicals. In addition to the greenhouse gases like
Yes.
carbon dioxide that are spewing out, it's also other toxic chemicals that are directly linked with cancer, birth defects, and these are being borne first and foremost directly by ordinary Chinese people. Tell us about China's cancer villages.
The cancer villages are horrifying. These are, we've only had one truly verified cancer cluster in the United States. There's been a lot of suspicious ones.
Right.
It's in China, we don't really know if there's a connection between a wastewater plant and the fact that a disproportionate number of people there are ill. But it sure seems like somebody who's reasonable would agree. There's about 500 cancer villages in China.
500.
Yes, they're in every one of China's 31 provinces. Most of them tend to be on the eastern populated coast of the country, where industry first moved in as China opened up in the late 80s and 90s. These are desperate places where you would find rivers the color of your chair, or you would see a little boy swimming in water that is so green it looks like it's paint. Where people are dying in droves and they're pleading for activists to come in. And what's really disheartening is a government that is claiming it wants to take environmental leadership. They will barely acknowledge the existence of a cancer village. They only recently sort of conceded there existed, but they quoting another newspaper. That's how it works a lot of times in China. You don't have somebody stepping front and acknowledging. They will use a party newspaper to sort of gently reveal to the people what they already knew from their friends.
Right.
So these cancer villages are very big deals. So are e-waste villages.
Right, and I wanted to ask you about that because we often think about China as
Yes.
being the place where our Walmart products are made, but China is
Right.
also importing a tremendous amount of product,
Right.
and that's electronic waste. And so how does that contribute?
It contributes enormously. You know, the iPads we have, the computers we love, the TVs we watch, the refrigerators holding our, you know, anti-GMO food. A lot of those were made in China, and they go back there for their death and reclamation because nobody else wants to break them apart. It's much more inexpensive to go back to China. There's treaties. There's been great environmental action on it, but it still slips through because it's profitable.
Right.
And when people break open let's say, a iPad, there are tremendous amounts of heavy metals and other dangerous equipment in there, dioxin, things called PA, benzenes, cadmium. These precious components are putting these people into early graves, and sometimes you'll see people working on them without gloves. There'll be little kids in a kitchen where somebody is moonlighting doing this, and it's pretty unregulated.
So no regulation.
It's unregulated.
So here in the U.S. we have
Yes.
the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is supposed to protect citizens from pollution, depending upon which president, of course, is in power.
Yes.
Does China have an analog to the EPA?
It does. It's called the Ministry of Environmental Protection. And though there's a lot of good-hearted, bright people there, they have a fraction of the number of people that work at the EPA, and they have 4 times the size of a population. So that tells you a lot about the priorities. Many of the people that work in the environmental world in China are attached to local bureaus. Those bureaus get their money from city halls. Those city halls are geared to industry and to GDP and impressing the spirits. One last thing about China and third world medicine, quote unquote. China, some decades ago, used to be that sort of typical sleeping giant where the #1 causes of premature mortality were lack of sanitation, poor nutrition, and tobacco smoke. All that has changed now in the post-World Trade Organization China. Cancer is the #1 cause of death. Lung cancer has skyrocketed. A Chinese farmer is 3 times more likely, I believe, to get stomach cancer than the average global citizen. In the cohort, the birth defects are so outrageous, many times higher than the United States. And my heart goes out to mothers there that are not exactly able to get on a plane and leave. You know, what do they think when they see a neighbor and their child is born without their spinal cord attached? You know, it's really the price of our consumerism, and a third of China's greenhouse gases come from making Western exports.
Wow.
I think we have to open up our eyes and get informed about what happens when that cash register rings.
Now, people here may think that our climate is not changing, warming. There are many climate deniers among us.
Yes.
And so we're happy to continue to buy cheap goods made in Chinese factories, and that we don't have to worry about pollution because the people living in Beijing,
Right.
which you say in your book is often referred to as grazing for
Correct.
the color of the air,
Exactly.
are the ones who are dealing directly with it. But you talk about this thing called the conveyor belt in the sky.
Right.
The tropospheric drift across the Pacific Ocean that affects air here in California because, of course, air moves.
Right. Yes. So there's a couple things going on. There's the climate change happening far up into space. But there's also the smog that is drifting up out of China, factory of the world, going across Japan, coming over the Arctic, sort of like the trajectory of a Soviet ICBM would have. But it's hitting California, Oregon, and Washington at levels that people don't really appreciate, partly because ozone is invisible. It's like carbon monoxide. And on some days, a third of our air of our ozone pollution in California on some days is from China. In the Sacramento area,
That's
three-quarters of it is from China. They are finding Chinese particulate matter and other pollution at the tops of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. China's responsible for 42% of mercury emissions, and mercury is a very dangerous element, and it's light, and it can travel around.
And get into the waterways?
And it's going as far as the Great Lakes. China's heavy metal pollution is the #1 cause of pollution in the Great Lakes.
And we can't blame just China for that. We blame ourselves for creating this huge demand for Chinese goods.
You know, when our mother said, if something seems to be too good in life, it's probably not true. That's what happened. What did we expect? The whole reason that companies, some desperate, some just greedy, outsourced to China, right, was because it cost 1/7 to produce a good there back in the heyday of their, first juggernaut status. 1/7 the cost. That's how we could afford goods. The American dollar in real terms has been stagnant since 1989. But the fact that you could afford cool gizmos with built-in obsolescence was driven by this deal that brought China into the World Trade Organization. At one point we had a very small trade deficit with China. Today it's almost $300 billion. And it's not really, it shouldn't surprise anybody. It's the fact that they can produce, they're nimble. They don't pay workers like we do. Their environmental rules heretofore have been pretty lax, so the equation is all tilted towards cheap production of goods. They got the jobs and the pollution, and we got the goodies we liked.
And eventually we too will get the pollution, are getting the pollution, and the whole world is paying the price in terms of climate change. Finally, in the last couple of minutes, Chip, is the hope for change of this very tilted system does that hope primarily lie within China, within ordinary citizens' ability to organize and hold their own government accountable?
Yes, but I will say not just China. It's your generation and my daughter's generation, borderless. It is the transparency movement, and it's not just about shaming people and making them feel sinful. It's about giving people information, and we're seeing this in China. China is very sophisticated, not just about hacking into the U.S. and Washington and corporations. They're very good at blocking dissent on the internet and limiting information. But for every time there is a government software writer, there's 5 or 6 creative Chinese or other younger people that can design apps that tell people what they need to know. So that is where my hope is. And the transparency movement, the internet, that won't allow a new coal plant to be built every 10 days like there's going on in China. And it will now give people information, and regardless of the government, they will now see where where the emissions are creating their life.
Well, we are all guilty of being part of this
Me too.
Product craze. Every time there's a new iPhone or a new product. I want to thank you so much, Chip, for joining us today. Best of luck with your book. My guest, Chip Jacobs, is the co-author with William J. Kelly of the book, The People's Republic of China. You've been listening to and watching Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our producer and our program director. Camila Ramirez and Christian Beck are our production interns. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.